Don't you absolutely love when a game you've been excited for lives up to your expectations? I cannot tell you how excited I have been for Deathloop, and unlike some other hyped up next-gen releases, I can happily tell you that this didn't disappoint. Now, if you've seen my content before or you know me personally, you'll know that I am a massive fan of Dishonored, and a huge believer in Arcane Studios. Quite simply, I love their work, and Deathloop isn't quite Dishonored, but it also kinda is. Honestly, I don't really want to get into the story of this game in this video, or about any kind of theories that I may or may not have about these games being potentially connected somehow, because it takes too long, and no one wants to hear me talk about that. So don't worry, if you haven't completed Deathloop or you haven't played it yet, I'm not going to go into any spoiler details or story details in this video. If you do watch this and you want to hear my thoughts on those things, be sure to listen to our podcast at the end of the month. Regardless, after putting 30 hours into Deathloop and completing it within a week of buying it, I've come out with the impression that Deathloop is a perfect spiritual successor to Dishonored, and it reaffirmed in my mind what separates a good spiritual successor from a bad one. Spiritual successors are commonplace in the games industry, but what are they exactly? They're not quite sequels, but they're also not quite new intellectual properties either. Well, if we follow the Wikipedia definition, spiritual successors are a fictional work which is similar to or directly inspired by another previous work, but does not explicitly continue the product line or media franchise of its predecessor. Spiritual successors can come about for a few reasons. Sometimes it's because a studio has a specific vision for the games that they make, and they want to continue to serve their niche audience. Other times it's because a developer wants to rework the way their sequels change their original gameplay concepts. About a year ago, I made a video about designing direct sequels successfully, but I believe that the requirements for designing spiritual successors is actually very different, and I think Deathloop is a great example of why that's the case. So here are the 3 things that I think a spiritual successor must do in order to be successful.
Say whatever you want to say, Billy. That you're here now is enough. I need your help.
Like old times?
Those days are gone. This is something bigger.
The first point I want to raise is actually pretty simple. Spiritual successors should have stuff in them from whatever game that they're paying tribute to. In Deathloop, thankfully this is nice and easy to see. The entire gameplay loop is inspired by Dishonored. It boasts immersive sim-style stealth and action gameplay as players try to assassinate targets in vastly open-ended levels. The great thing about Arcane is that you can really see them evolve from game to game, and this is no different. We can see concepts and gameplay elements from Arcane's entire back catalogue in Deathloop. For example, the way mana or power works in Deathloop is directly inspired by the positive feedback that they received about a change they made in Dishonored Death of the Outsider. Before that, mana was consumed and refueled by players taking potions, but in Death of the Outsider, we saw a change to a recharging system, which was brought forward into Deathloop. Elsewhere, we can see gameplay mechanics like Shift and Nexus, Shift being a fully functional rework of Dishonored 1's blink mechanic, Dishonored 2's was terrible, and Nexus being a power which links the fate of enemies together just like Domino did in Dishonored 2. In terms of narrative design and structure, we can see many storytelling influences from Prey and its Mooncrash DLC, which placed a heightened emphasis on mystery storytelling and even introduced the idea of playing the same day in the same levels again and again. In adding a multiplayer element to Deathloop, we can see the now successfully integrated use of a concept from The Crossing, a cancelled Arcane project that would see a single-player game be invaded by other players who could either help or hurt progress. Other smaller things, like when you hit your melee key, you get the sadistically sweet kick from Dark Messiah of Might and Magic! And finally, in terms of level design, we can see that, well, it's an Arcane game. You should know what to expect with these levels, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So those are just some of the slightly more detailed concepts that were brought forward. But the aforementioned stuff that needs to be in a spiritual successor doesn't always need to be that heavy. It can also include things like Easter eggs and fan nods. In Deathloop, we can see plenty of those. For instance, these wrenches that are a pretty commonly found prop in Dishonored, some audio effects and recordings and voice lines that sound almost exactly like Prey, the arcade machines that display wrong titles only of famous Bethesda games. There's one trophy for entering 0451 into a keypad in the game, because that is a very famous safe code combination from pretty much every immersive sim game known to man. And there are also lots of story things that I would love to get into here as well, but seriously, don't let me get started on the story stuff, because I just won't be able to stop. The point here is Arcane Leon didn't just copy and paste their gameplay from Dishonored 2, they looked through their entire back catalogue and they brought forward the things that worked, the things fans loved, and the devices that they enjoyed making games with the most. The result is a fully functioning highlight reel of Arcane's best games that is probably the most marketable package to a mainstream audience the studio has ever produced.
Good morning, Morgan. I'm Dr. Bellamy. Looks like we have some tests to run through today. Probably not the kind of thing you're used to, I imagine, but trust me, you're going to do fantastic.
But there's a step further than just putting old stuff in a game and calling it a spiritual successor. And Arcane took it. They didn't just think about their own evolution as developers, they thought about their players' evolution as well. Dishonored is a game with just oh so much replayability. I swear, I could go back to those games again tomorrow and play them for the 1,000,001th time and still find something new in them. But the disconnect kind of comes when you realize that playing them over and over again and finding new routes, letters, and overhearing NPC conversations doesn't always have the ripple effect that you want. Much of the time, your level's outcome, i.e. the way you actually kill a target, will probably stay the same, and it's not as though finding that new route or new information helps your progression, because you'll probably forget about it by the time you come back to that level, which will be in your next playthrough. Deathloop, the spiritual successor to Dishonored, is a game about replaying the same day over and over again. It takes that idea of Arcane's replayability and it allows you to use it to your advantage in your current playthrough. In this instance, Deathloop shows us that creating a spiritual successor isn't just about improving on what the developers do, but also putting a different spin on what the players will do. Arcane's a studio that has built up a cult following. In other words, people who play their games have usually played more than one of them and probably to completion. So by this stage, they're very wise to the developers' antics. To counter this and keep the Arcane gameplay experience fresh, the studio had to start getting wise to players' antics too. And I can prove that. Alright, so how many of you, show of hands, don't be shy, have played a Dishonored level more than once, and regardless of how many different ways you can play it, you've just played it in the exact same way as you always do? Come on, show of hands. Don't be shy. Come on, put them up. Yeah, all of you. Well, in Deathloop, Arcane knew that that would happen, so they decided the game would strike back. If you try to kill Alexis in the same way at his party over and over again, the Eternalists kind of start to expect it. It'll gradually get harder and harder until the entire level just swarms you for making him dance for the 50th time before shooting him in the skull. Lastly for this point, I think we actually have the best example. When you play Dishonored, it's clear to see that you can play whatever way you like, but the Arcane would probably prefer it if you played stealthily. I mean, if you count the number of routes in Return to the Tower from Dishonored 1, for example, like I did in my video about it, you can probably count 3 or 4 stealthy approaches, but only 1 or 2 loud ones. Deathloop, on the other hand, puts far more of an emphasis on action instead of stealth. When stealth goes out the window because an Eternalist has spotted you, Deathloop forces you to push through and adapt because there is no save feature. Whereas in a Dishonored game, you would be allowed to reset. There being no save feature is the best example of Arcane reinventing their gameplay for a spiritual successor's audience. This small difference fundamentally changes the way you play Deathloop when compared to Dishonored. It's an evolution, but more on the player experience end than the development end. The final thing I think a spiritual successor needs to do is show us why it isn't a direct sequel. That being said, the question we have to ask for this point is, why did Arcane not just make this Dishonored 3? I for one think there's a couple of reasons. Arcane, in my opinion, showed us why Deathloop was not Dishonored 3 because this game didn't have the same market as Dishonored. This allowed them to put spins on a system they knew worked, while also captivating new buyers with guns blazing action gameplay instead of sneaky stabby stealth. And alright, even if this does end up being confirmed as a spin-off at some point down the line, or it just ends up creating more buzz for Dishonored 3, it justifies itself as being able to stand on its own without that franchise's title, and that is a fundamentally important thing for a spiritual successor. The final reason I think this wasn't Dishonored 3 is because there were too many ideas and concepts in Deathloop, both narratively and gameplay-wise, that just wouldn't have fit inside the, dare I say it, rigid Dishonored formula. Oh my god, did I just call my favorite game of all time rigid? A stronger emphasis on narrative and mystery, an evolution of the try and try again gameplay from the pre-Mooncrash DLC, the opportunity for the next generation of arcane leaders to step up and make something of their own. You name it, there are just too many things about Deathloop that mean it wouldn't really fit in the Dishonored 3 box. In conclusion, Deathloop shows us a pretty fantastic example of how strong spiritual successors should be made. They should look to the old in order to bring forward what worked, but they must reinvent. There should be a focus on encouraging players to play differently than they would in a direct sequel. And finally, we should be able to see, in more ways than one, why a spiritual successor isn't a direct sequel, whether that be creative differences or differing markets. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. We here at Game Coping actually took a bit of a break from making videos over the course of the pandemic because, to be honest with you, I really couldn't get into a creative headspace. Unfortunately, that now means that the YouTube algorithm is really not favoring us as much as it was, so we could really use some help. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscription button and the bell icon to be notified whenever we upload videos. Also, scroll down to the comments section and tell me if my list of things spiritual successors should do applies to your favorite spiritual successor. Thanks again so much for watching, have a fulfilling day, and tune in next time.
All the way. Mr. You, please make yourself